Hello, I'm Reverend Yin, founder of Evolving Enneagram. I'm here to chat with you today about conscious community. First, why is it even important? Why do we want to talk about it? What are the gifts that this having intentional and conscious community could do for you in your life, in your Enneagram informed journey? So I am inspired by the words of relationship expert Harville Hendricks, who wrote the book Getting the Love You Want. And he has said, we are born in relationship, we are wounded in relationship, and we can heal in relationship. Whew. So these words inspire my journey of realizing that so much of the way we can show up in the world, ways that we can show up that even sabotage our own good, come from early childhood wounding, right? Come from our Enneagram based childhood wounds, or the bias of type that kind of keeps us in a place of lack and limitation. And so I want to invite the consideration that the biggest blessing of community, that in a way, it's actually some of the difficult things that happen in community that bring forth old wounding, but not just because we're masochistic to repeat that wound. It's this idea that instead of leaving the moment you feel pained by something that just triggers an old wound of yours, depending on whether all the criteria are met for your safety, to really consider that this is a chance to go deeper. This is the chance to heal the wound and not necessarily just to keep running. So I want to begin by talking about what I even mean by conscious community, so we can talk about what are the gifts of this. I happen to be an interspiritual unity minister. And what I mean by that is that in my work, I draw from the world's religious and spiritual traditions and finding the wisdom in each of them. So I might find for myself that the loving kindness meditations that come from Buddhism are really, really helpful for forgiveness work. But I might also find that in the mystical, Catholic tradition, there are these great prayers, welcoming prayer practice that I personally use that help me to process triggering emotions and really deal with grief, etc. So these are some of the spiritual practices that are incorporated into conscious community for me. But for you, it might be your yoga community. For you, it might be a Christian church. It might be a mosque. It might be your pagan group. I really am open to whatever it is that feels right for you. And I think what's important about conscious community isn't that it's any particular tradition, but that it really feels authentic to you and chosen by you. And that's the key, right? Because so many of us end up in what we call circumstantial communities. It's communities based on things well, you're a mom, and so now you're in a group of people who happen to all have the same life circumstance, right, of being a mom or a dad, a parent, right? Or you might live in a certain neighborhood, and so there are groups that kind of come together based on the neighborhood that you live in. And so I want to make a distinction here from communities that we sort of just end up with because they're common affiliations, and something that you really consciously choose into, that you're saying, hey, whether it's because you're seeking some information or knowledge or from that particular group of people, maybe practices, it's sort of you're looking at the people in the community going, hey, I'm impressed with some of these folks. They have what I've got, what I want, right? And so there's something to look at where you look at how the people are living in a certain community. Do they live the example of who you'd like to be? And then the other piece is, again, this conscious choice of going, okay, well, does this really fit my authentic self? Like, is there room for me, or do I feel like I have to overly adapt or sacrifice my integrity in order to belong? And there's some maybe more traditional or fundamental systems or groups where you feel like, God, I don't really believe all this. Like I have very different views, and but they say that you have to have our views. Now, it's okay if you have different views, and those views are welcome, but it's important to feel like who you are, like that if you were honest with people in the group about who you are and what you believe, that you wouldn't feel cast out. And so that's so vital to feeling like you can be your authentic self. Because my wish for you is that community doesn't just let you be your authentic self, it actually invites you to be. It actually encourages you to bring forth like your own wholeness and maybe things that in other communities you left behind. And so think about that. Like, what parts of you, I know that there are many folks in some of my communities who identify as type 4, and they have been in places where they feel like it's not safe for them to show up in all of their feelings. And so, for instance, if you identify as an Enneagram type 4, that might be really important for you to be like, is there space here for all of this? I mean, I want to grow. It's not just being about being lost in my feelings, but at least I don't want to feel shamed, right, as a result of having my feelings. And so, for instance, you might be a type 8 who is a little bit more sort of assertive, sometimes even aggressive on the Enneagram. Like, and you might kind of come into the community really forcefully. And if the community is immediately like going, oh, back off a bit, like be peaceful like us. Like there's something about that that can feel really disingenuous, right? That doesn't let you sort of charge ahead with your energy, as opposed to a community that's like, oh, yeah, whoa, like we're not used to this, but maybe this difference between us can actually help us grow. Like that to me is a healthy community that can embrace like the ways you're different. You don't have to be the same, but like can actually it like make space for that difference and even be changed by the way that you are, so that you're bringing something special to the community. So those are just a couple examples of like how to check in for like, can you show up authentically, or do you feel constantly like if you're entering this community you have to hide parts of yourself or subdue parts of yourself for you to be accepted or for you to feel like you have belonging? And so those are a few things to look at in looking at conscious community. What are my spiritual beliefs, or what do I want to have, right? Again, that doesn't mean that everybody has to agree with you, or like in some of my communities we have diversity, so people don't actually all believe the same thing, but all different beliefs are welcome. Maybe you're a type 5 or type 6 that has to like question, right? There are folks in my groups where in there, maybe some of them are from a more traditional Catholic background, and they're not allowed to ask questions. That it's heresy to question their faith and beliefs. But my belief is, if you can't question them, how can you make it truly yours? And so looking for a space in which you feel like you don't have to agree. I'm usually the teacher and the minister, and I really try to make an effort to make it clear that like, you don't have to agree with what I believe. I invite you to be open to it, or else why are you here in the first place listening to me, right? But there's this idea that like, I hope you only take from it what you feel is authentically for you, and let your own wisdom, your inner intuition and wisdom guide you, right? And so those are some of the pieces around conscious community. And so how can that help you? So having these spaces often brings up your old wounds. Like I feel like it's actually a good moment, the moment when somehow, oh no, like this community reminds me of my childhood, right? The same issues come up, but instead of running away from them, like for instance, for me, I was like deeply criticized as a child, like and I happen to identify as a type 1 on the Enneagram, which is already like ultra sensitive to criticism. I probably have a lot of ones in my family, right? My mom is probably a 2-wing 1, that kind of thing. So if I experience criticism in an environment, my old way was to run. Like, I'm not staying here. This is not right for me, but I mean, clearly, if you're experiencing any type of real physical or verbal abuse, that's a whole nother matter. Like, I'm never saying like stay there, but you know, if you're kind of feeling like, yeah, maybe this is a little bit of an oversensitivity of mine, or maybe I repeat this pattern everywhere I go. Like, I'm like, the moment I feel criticized, I'm out of here. And so I remember first joining a community in California called Unity in Marin. And I remember hearing critical feedback about myself. Like, I felt so misunderstood and I wanted to run. And instead I was like, well, okay, um, not everybody's going to like me. And I hated that fact, by the way, you know, like I wanted everyone to like me and think that I was right and think that I was good. And I was like, okay, maybe there's a lesson in here for me. Or maybe if I stay and I know that people disagree with me, there was like basically someone had behind the scenes expressed a disagreement with something. I'm like, oh, by staying and being still a part of the community, I got to heal this piece of like, you know what? I don't have to be right and you don't have to be right, or we don't have to agree. You know, you can criticize like my position on this thing, but I still belong. And I wouldn't have come to know that if I had just bolted. Like, there's a way in which I could stay and receive the gift of continuing to be a part of this community, even then eventually joining leadership in that community, being serving on the board, etc. So I ended up staying 6 years until I moved out to the Midwest to go to ministerial school. But what a blessing for me to experience for the first time in my life a group of people where I felt like, hey, you know what? Actually, this is good that I don't feel like everything has to work out perfectly. That was an important healing and life lesson for me, but it wouldn't have happened if I just had my trigger and decided, oh, see, you don't fit my ideal. And that's a big part of understanding that community is just a group of human beings. And so we have this idealized version, especially when we're thinking of a spiritual community, right? Like that somehow the moment people show up as humans, we reject them. And we're like, oh, is that because maybe you're rejecting of yourself when you show up in your humanness? So it's something to consider, like, how hard are you on yourself? Like, if you can back it off a bit and go, hey, we're just here to try, we're just here to grow, and everyone is on that path. You know, sure, certain people in the community I might not be best friends with, or maybe not even like interact closely with, but maybe within this community, if it satisfies all of those other requirements for me, maybe I'll stick it out for a while and I'll take a look at myself and do my Enneagram work of going, hey, is this trigger, does it look awfully like the trigger of my type? Is this my old storyline? You know, I mean, so like as a type 1, a lot of times, like, I could be judgmental. I could be like, oh, see, you weren't perfect and therefore I need to leave now. This is not, it's not okay to be human. And if that's the storyline coming up in community, I'm going to be a little suspicious of it, you know, and go, hey, maybe that's what needs healing here. And definitely for me now, community has become a place where it's like, oh, I get to be human. Now I know I'm loved even when I'm not perfect, right? For type 2s, when you come into community, you may burn yourself out. Like, a lot of times it's sort of like, the only way I know to relate to people is to give, right? And then I get tired because I've given too much. But whose fault is that? You know, it's like, hey, maybe it's your life pattern and trend to think that that's all you have to offer. So maybe you back it off when you join community and you don't volunteer for everything, right? So really recognizing how your own type structure can actually sabotage your experience in community. And then, like, say you're a type 3 and you're like, oh, well, maybe you're new and you're in a place where you feel invisible. You know, maybe that could be really healing for you, right? Because you're like, oh, I'm not comfortable when I don't stand out in some way, right? Or I'm not comfortable if I don't get recognized as being accomplished within this community. You know, I encourage 3s who join my communities, don't lead with your resume, please. Because how will you know that people love you for who you are when you lead with your resume? Then people are like, ooh, maybe you could do this for us. Maybe you could do that. And then you get caught in the same trap that you are in the bulk of your life, right? Type 4s, you know, that I mentioned it earlier, but a lot of times you have an ambivalent relationship to belonging. So if you recognize that and you're like, wait, okay, a part of me doesn't want to belong because I'm so scared that belonging means I'm common, I'm ordinary. And if I'm ordinary, I'm not important enough. And so you've got to look at your own tendency toward that. Like, is it okay to just be part of and not stand out? And so maybe some of your discomfort is like not knowing that that's okay yet, and really coming into a place where maybe it's not a bad thing if you're not seen as special or outside, and not even needing to see yourself all the time like that, right? If you're a type 5, then yeah, sometimes unless you feel like you're competent or you can share a body of knowledge and expertise with the community, it can be kind of overwhelming and intimidating. And so you can kind of hide back behind, like you can even seem like you're standoffish or elitist when really you're just being a little like afraid that you don't have something to offer. And so maybe you can be willing to risk that you can just show up, that you're not, that you don't. Fives, come with this perspective that you're like over here and somehow you have to bridge it. But think about the Enneagram. Every point on the Enneagram is already part of the circle. So if you treat it like, hey, what if I just assumed that I'm not like way over here, right? And isolated, and that somehow I have to find a way to bridge through what I can offer in my expertise or in my knowledge. And instead, I can just assume that I'm a participant here, even if I'm just a listening participant. And so maybe I can experience some healing from that. If you're type 6, it depends on your subtype to some degree, right? So for type 6, definitely there's like, questioning of authority, like what are they saying? Do I trust that? Do I trust them? And so just recognize that you're always going to have issues of trust. That doesn't mean it's the wrong place for you, that you're going, just assume that you will fluctuate, right, between um like buying in and not buying in, and that's just part of your type structure. And one way of testing, like, is this right for you, is really letting yourself be willing to trust your gut. Like, I believe that you deeply know what's right for you, and if you don't let your mind spin, like when you find your mind spinning, questioning, wondering, just drop into your body center, feel your feet on the ground, and let that be your anchor for like, what's true here. Is there anything threatening in this moment? If there is, get out of there. If there isn't, you can move forward. Check in with your body. And then for sevens, oh gosh, sevens are like the next new, so many sevens I know, like, oh, I want to join 10 yoga communities, or, like, I'm excited about this and I go way forward into it, but then I get bored, or like then it just feels like it's not right for me anymore. That's actually the time that I recommend you go deeper, because that's going to help offset this notion of just jumping and never being satisfied. And so recognizing that when you stay, that the orientation towards staying and deepening and risking boredom, but finding that beneath boredom is something deeper, that it's actually fulfillment, but you didn't know because you're so busy hopping and hopping. So taking an opportunity, again, if it's a safe community for you to join, that's important. Then maybe going, hey, you know what, I've jumped around all my life, and maybe this is time for me to like face some of the negative stuff. You can tend to jump when you also start to feel like more negative feelings, but just I invite you to consider, if you identify as a type 7, that these negative feelings are actually a pathway to your healing. And that just because you feel some grief or sadness, like, if anything, this is the time for you to let yourself finally heal some of these old wounds, or else you're going to be taking them with you. No matter what vacation, no matter what new adventure, you're going to take this with you if you don't heal it. So use community. Be like, oh, is it really okay for me to stay in my pain? It's so scary for you, but I invite you to trust that when you are willing to do it, oh my goodness, you're going to come off with more satisfaction and more true joy in your life. And then eights, like, eights are the rugged individualists, right? It can be harder to like join a community unless you're leading it. Like, and so this is where, hey, maybe you can lead in every other area of your life, but you can learn how to receive here. You know, the eights I talk to don't even realize that they don't receive, you know, because they're so used to being so self-reliant all their lives. They're so tough and they're so armored up, and go, oh, wow, yeah, I might risk being rejected or being betrayed here. Like, but it's actually more courageous. You know, Brene Brown talks about it when she talks about vulnerability, right? That it's about having the courage to show your vulnerability and weakness. And that is risky. That's why it's actually the height of courage to do this, that you're more powerful when you're willing to do this, not when you meekly, you know, protect your weakness back here and then armor up out there toward the world, and then only engage when you can be boss or you can be in control. So really recognize that in yourself. And then finally, nines, you know, in community, you can tend to want to stay undisturbed, right? And so, oh, it's great when everyone's doing a little peace song and everything, but as soon as there's like conflict, boom, like you're out of there. Like either mentally you've escaped into some other realm, you've numbed out, you've gone to sleep. But I really encourage you to consider that it's that moment that's going to help you go, hey, because there's a part of nines that don't believe they belong unless they sort of blend in. Hey, maybe you can take a stand. Maybe that's the point of conscious community for you, the learning how to find your voice, and even when it's diverse and different from that of the others around you. And so across the Enneagram, these are just some examples of how community can bless you. And of course, I've lumped in there also the ways in which your type can kind of sabotage your prospects within conscious community space. And so an accepting, non-dogmatic, non-judging space for you to explore parts of yourself that maybe have been wounded or hidden behind here, right? So you can bring them forward. Like maybe it's finding your voice and finding a community where you can begin to safely speak up. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you're used to being in charge, and like in community, you can learn what it is to receive, right? You, like similarly, if you're used to being the giver and coming forward, like what is it like for you to be the one asking for help? Oh, so that can be so difficult, but so powerful, so transformative. And that is my hope for you, that perhaps by hearing me today, that you are inspired to seek out or return to a community where you feel like, hey, maybe there's a little bit more inner work I can do, and I can find some kinship, and know that even though I may be different from the people in this group, even just the knowing that other people are making this journey consciously themselves helps me to feel not so alone on my journey, and helps me to check my own stinking thinking, right? And so recognize that, oh, like if I'm just left on my own, like I can rationalize certain things, right? I'm like, oh, I think I'm so smart, but I can tell myself lies about like where I am on my path. Community keeps me accountable. It can gift me with healing and transformation. Sometimes the things that hurt me the most about it are the things that end up creating the biggest healing ever, if I'm willing to look at myself and do the work of like what felt hurt, and what can I bring forward that expresses my authenticity and wholeness. And so that is my prayer for you, that you live more fully into the magnificent being that you already are in truth inside yourself, that is more revealed in your outer world. Thanks for joining me.